credible sexual assault allegations, and the FBI confirmed what we Senate investigators already concluded. That is this: there's nothing in the supplemental FBI background investigation report that we didn't already know. These uncorroborated accusations have been unequivocally and repeatedly rejected by Judge Kavanaugh, and neither the Judiciary Committee nor the FBI could locate any third parties who can attest to any of the allegations. There also is no contemporaneous evidence. This investigation found no hint of misconduct, and the same is true of 6 prior FBI investigations conducted during Judge Kavanaugh's 25 years of public service. Nothing an investigator, including career FBI special agents, does ever be good enough to satisfy Democrat leaderships in Washington who staked out opposition to Judge Kavanaugh before he was even nominated. There is simply no reason then to deny Judge Kavanaugh a seat on the Supreme Court on the basis of the evidence presented to us. The Democratic strategy used against Judge Kavanaugh has made one thing clear: they will never be satisfied, no matter how fair and thorough the process is. 31 years ago, the Senate Democrats' treatment of Robert Bork, their playbook remains the same. For the left wing, advice and consent has become search and destroy, a demolition derby. I'm pleased to support Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation. I'm sorry for what the whole family went through the last several weeks. We should all admire Kavanaugh's willingness to serve his country despite the way he's been treated. It would be a travesty then if the Senate did not confirm the most qualified nomination in our nation's history. The multitude of allegations against him have proven to be false. They've also proven that no discussion of his qualifications came up with any discussion of his qualifications. Nothing showed he wasn't qualified. We had a campaign of distraction from his outstanding qualifications, a campaign of destruction of this fine individual. What we have learned is the resistance that has existed since the day after the November 2016 election is centered right here on Capitol Hill. They have encouraged mob rule. When you hear things about get in their face, bother people at every restaurant where you can find a cabinet member, these are coming from public service that ought to set an example of civility in American society. And it's been made worse by what has happened to Judge Kavanaugh. I hope we can say no to mob rule by voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. I yield the floor.
Procedural vote about 40 minutes from now, Senator.
My expectation is that we are successful with the cloture vote, and then we'll tee up the nomination tomorrow, probably tomorrow evening. And I couldn't agree more with everything that Chuck Grassley said. The real sham here is the behavior of the Democrats throughout this process, beginning with the day before the nomination when they were against a fill-in-the-blank nominee.
If that is the case, that means Jeff Flake is a yes vote, and Susan Collins would be a yes vote. Do you believe that to be what we're about to see here? And where is Senator Murkowski on that?
I'm not going to speak for my colleagues, but I am confident that we will have a successful cloture vote. And we'll see that. There's been a lot of study. I spent almost 4 hours in the secured facility yesterday reviewing the documents. My colleagues did. And if anything, the veracity of the allegations were reduced as a result of the additional information that all the members have seen. So the only thing they have left, if they're talking about Judge Kavanaugh's temperament based on his hearing last week, that wasn't Judge Kavanaugh, that was Brett Kavanaugh defending his wife, his daughters, and his own extraordinary reputation. And I think he did a great job there. He's got great temperament. He's demonstrated it on the bench with over 300 opinions. He's got 2 unanimously well-qualified ratings from the American Bar Association. What the Democrats say is the gold standard. It's time to confirm this judge, and it's time to end this nonsense on the Judiciary
Last
Committee.
question, just to be clear, you believe they'll pass cloture, but will he be confirmed tomorrow?
I do. I believe that he'll pass cloture, and I do believe that he'll get confirmed.
Tom Tillis, thank you, the Republican from North Carolina. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dianne Feinstein, now on the floor.
Adopted, this argument could rewrite Supreme Court precedent and require courts to determine whether a young woman had a sufficient support network when making her decision, even in cases, as is in this one, where she had gone before a court. His reasoning demonstrates that Judge Kavanaugh not only is willing to disregard precedent, but his opinions fail to appreciate the challenging realities women face when making these most difficult decisions. When I asked him about whether Roe and Casey were settled law and whether they were correctly decided, he refused to answer. He would only say these cases are entitled to respect. Roe v. Wade, as we all know, is one of a series of cases that upheld an individual's right to decide who to marry, where to send your children to school, what kind of medical care you can receive at the end of life, as well as whether and when to have a family. The government cannot interfere with these decisions according to these cases. Another issue that gives me great pause is Judge Kavanaugh's extreme view on guns. In reviewing his record and judicial opinions, it's clear his views go well beyond simply being pro-gun. During a lecture at Notre Dame Law School, Judge Kavanaugh himself said he'd be, quote, the first to acknowledge that most lower court judges have disagreed with his views on the Second Amendment. Specifically, in District of Columbia v. Heller, Judge Kavanaugh wrote in a dissenting opinion that unless guns were regulated, either at the time of the Constitution was written or traditionally throughout history, they cannot be regulated now, end quote. In his own words, gun laws are unconstitutional unless they are, quote, traditional or common in the United States, end quote. Judge Kavanaugh would have struck down D.C.'s assault weapons ban because they have not historically been banned. This logic means that as weapons become more advanced and more dangerous, they cannot be regulated at all. Exactly. When I asked Judge Kavanaugh about his views that if a gun is in common use, it cannot be regulated, he replied this way, and I quote, "There are millions and millions and millions of semi-automatic rifles that are possessed, so that seemed to fit common use and not being a dangerous and unusual weapon," end quote. Think about that. Judge Kavanaugh made up a new standard that had nothing to do with common use, but instead relied on whether a gun is widely possessed and owned as determinative as to whether it is subject to any regulation. The United States makes up 4% of the worldwide population, but we own 42% of the world's guns. By Judge Kavanaugh's standard, no state or locality will be able to place any limitation on guns because of widespread ownership in this country. I'm also concerned about his views on presidential power. Specifically, he has said that sitting presidents cannot be indicted, cannot be prosecuted, should not be investigated, and should have the authority to fire a special counsel at will. In other words, the President of the United States is above and outside the law. These views raise serious concerns that should concern us all, especially at a time when the president continually threatens to fire the leadership of the Department of Justice for failing to be loyal and reining in the Mueller investigation. These views alone are not sufficient for me to vote against Judge Kavanaugh. But what we have seen and experienced in the past several weeks has raised serious new concerns, concerns I believe should worry us all. Judges are expected to be, quote, even-handed, unbiased, impartial, and courteous, end quote. However, at the hearing last week, we saw a man filled with anger and aggression. Judge Kavanaugh raised his voice, he interrupted senators, he accused of Democrats of, quote, lying in wait, end quote, and replacing, quote, advice and consent with search and destroy, end quote. He even went so far as to say that Dr. Ford's allegations were nothing more than, quote, a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, end quote. Quote, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, end quote. How could he? This behavior revealed a hostility and belligerence that is unbecoming of someone seeking to be elevated to the United States Supreme Court. His display was so shocking that more than 2,400 law professors from around the country have expressed their opposition. They wrote, and I quote, instead of trying to sort out with reason and care the allegations that were raised, Judge Kavanaugh responded in an intemperate, inflammatory, and partial manner, as he interrupted and at times was discourteous to senators, end quote. The professors concluded, and I quote, we have differing views about other qualifications of Judge Kavanaugh, but we are united as professors of law and scholars of judicial institutions in believing he did not display the impartiality and judicial temperament requisite to sit on the highest court of our land. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to enter a full copy of the letter in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Finally, I want to mention the serious and credible allegations raised by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez, the two women who came forward to tell their experiences facing sexual assault. When Dr. Ford decided to make her story public, she faced all her worst fears. She was harassed, she received death threats, she had to relocate her home, her husband, and two children, and yet, in less than a week, she came before the Senate and told 21 senators she had never met, along with millions of Americans, about the most tragic, traumatic, and difficult experience of her life. And she did so with poise, grace, and most importantly, bravery. Unfortunately, she was met with partisanship and hostility. My Republican colleagues have largely chosen to ignore her powerful testimony. Senators weren't allowed to hear from any witnesses who could corroborate or refute her account. They refused to gather evidence or do an impartial investigation into her allegations. Deborah Ramirez also reluctantly came forward to tell her story. Like Dr. Ford, Ms. Ramirez offered to speak to the FBI. Both Ford and Ramirez submitted evidence to support their allegations, including naming over 24 witnesses each. Unfortunately, the limited investigation that was conducted by the FBI failed to interview any one of the witnesses these two women identified who could support her account. Let me say that again. They refused to investigate, to talk with any of the 24 witnesses that could have supported their accounts. Mr. President, I think it's important to remember why we're here today. We're here to determine whether Judge Kavanaugh has demonstrated the impartiality, the temperament, the even-handedness that's needed to serve on this great high court of our land. If confirmed, he will join 8 other individuals who are charged with deciding how the laws of our land are interpreted and applied. He would be a deciding vote on the most important issues affecting our country and every American for generations to come. Mr. President, Madam President, based on all the factors we have before us, I do not believe Judge Kavanaugh has earned this seat. Thank you.